All right. Time to dig into this mountain of research you've sent over on timberland and farmland investing.
And it looks like we're zeroing in on permanent crops for this deep dive. So
Yeah,
ready to unearth some interesting insights on this investment strategy.
absolutely. One of the things that's really interesting about farmland investing
Oh,
is how it's changing. It's not just your typical image of inheriting grandpa's plot of land anymore.
right.
We're
Yeah.
talking about like sophisticated investors looking for ways to diversify their portfolios,
Mm-hmm.
hedge against inflation, find sustainable ways to grow their wealth.
Yeah. And speaking of sophisticated, those numbers, folks over at NCEREF,
Right.
they always have their finger on the pulse.
Yeah.
And their Q1 2024 report showed a pretty decent total annual yield for cropland.
Yeah, 9.1%.
1.1%, that's not bad at all.
Yeah, and that's split between rental income, which is about 3.3%, and then appreciation,
Okay.
clocking in at 5.7%. So it gives us a good baseline to compare things to.
Yeah, good foundation to start with,
Exactly.
especially as we start branching out into this whole world of permanent crops.
Right.
And I got to say, one article called The Money Trees, which definitely got my attention.
Yeah, they're often seen that way.
So we're talking about planting once and then basically reaping the rewards for years,
Mhm.
sometimes decades, right?
Exactly. It's the long game. You plant it once, and then you have harvests year after year, sometimes for decades on end.
Wow.
Almonds, apples, pecans, even pistachios
Okay.
all fall into this category.
So instead of like your annual planting cycles of, say, corn or soybeans,
Right.
permanent crops, you've got the land itself appreciating,
Mm-hmm.
but then you've also got the increasing value of these maturing trees.
Yeah, it's like a double whammy of appreciation.
That's a pretty unique model.
It is, and it's been generating some pretty impressive returns, too.
Okay, like what are we talking about here?
I mean, some permanent crops have delivered like a 15% annualized yield over the past decade,
15%.
which is significantly higher than the 5% that you typically see with annual row crops.
Yeah, that's a significant difference.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's not just about the profits, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
There's a whole sustainability angle to this too, isn't there?
Absolutely. You're not just looking at the returns.
Mm-hmm.
You're aligning your portfolio with a more sustainable future.
Okay.
Permanent crops can contribute to carbon sequestration,
Right.
improving soil health, boosting biodiversity.
So you're basically attracting a whole new wave of investors who are looking for both profit and purpose.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot.
Like a powerful combination.
Yeah.
But let's be real for a second. High returns usually come with at least some level of risk.
Of course. Yeah.
So what are some of the potential downsides that investors need to be aware of when we're talking about permanent crops?
Well, I think one of the major things to consider is that the longer timelines associated with permanent crops
Right.
present unique challenges. One of those is the specialized knowledge needed.
Okay, this isn't just throwing some seeds in the ground and hoping for the best.
Not quite. You're talking about managing an orchard or a grove, specialized pest control.
It's a whole different ballgame from annual crops.
Exactly. It's much more specialized, which is why you see a lot of these investments structured through private funds,
Oh, okay.
because they have the expertise to handle these complexities.
They have that green thumb, so to speak.
Exactly. They have the green thumbs. But that brings us to another potential drawback, which is
Let me guess. Fees.
exactly those fees. Expertise doesn't come cheap, right?
No, it doesn't.
And then there's the issue of liquidity, or should I say lack thereof.
Ah, yes. That
Uh,
can be a sticking point for some investors.
It can, and understandably so, because private funds often come with lockup periods.
We're talking like 5, 10 years, maybe even longer.
Sometimes even longer, yeah. So that means your money is tied up for a while. It's definitely a long-term play.
And what about those curveballs that Mother Nature likes to throw our way?
Yes. Always effective.
A freak hailstorm, a prolonged drought, that kind of thing.
That's part of the deal with agricultural investing, right? You're at the mercy of those factors that are beyond your control.
True. But this is where the whole diversification benefit comes into play.
Exactly. That's why we look at things like the NCREA report.
Right. Those data gurus.
Yeah. And their data consistently shows that farmland, and this includes permanent crops, has a low correlation with traditional assets. So stocks and bonds might be doing the jitterbug during a downturn,
Right.
but farmland tends to hold its ground, you know?
Yeah. It adds a layer of resilience to a portfolio.
Exactly. That's the beauty of it.
It's like that steady eddy that you want around when things get a little crazy. So it's about finding that balance between risk and reward.
Exactly.
But for someone who's maybe new to this whole world, how do you even begin to navigate this? I mean, we talked about private funds, but what other options are out there?
Well, there are actually quite a few avenues, each with its own set of pros and cons, you know.
It's like that choose your own adventure, but instead of dragons, we've got almonds and pecans.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked about private funds with their expertise, but we also talked about their downsides like liquidity constraints and those fees.
And those fees can certainly add up over time.
They can. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have direct ownership, where you're calling all the shots, but that requires significant capital.
Right.
And of course, that green thumb that we were talking about earlier.
Definitely not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, you got to be ready to get your hands dirty, literally. And then you have things like REITs.
REITs.
Real estate investment trusts. They come in both public and private flavors.
Okay.
And they specialize in farmland, and they can offer varying levels of liquidity.
So the classic trade-off.
Yeah.
Ease of access and liquidity versus potentially higher returns.
Yeah, that's the trade-off. You gotta weigh.
Tells us homework is required.
Definitely, due diligence is crucial with any investment. But with REITs, it's even more paramount. Look at the fees, management structure, underlying assets.
All those things can impact your returns.
All of that factors in, yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about the world of crowdfunding.
Right.
It seems like there's a platform for everything these days.
There is.
And Farmland's no exception.
Yeah, platforms like EcoTrader, which you mentioned in your research,
Right.
have made farmland investing, including permanent crops, much more accessible.
Okay.
You can invest in specific farms or projects.
So you don't need to be a millionaire to get involved.
Yeah, it's lowered the barrier to entry.
Lower the barrier to entry,
That's
but
it.
hopefully not the standards.
Hopefully not, but that's why due diligence is so important.
Right.
Just because it's easy to click a button doesn't mean you should jump in blindly.
Exactly. Exactly. It's still an investment.
Very much so, yeah.
Knowledge is power. Right?
Always.
Speaking of which, we've talked about farmland pretty broadly, but geography has to play a huge role.
Huge. Absolutely.
I mean, are we talking about those sprawling Midwestern fields, or
It's a good question.
are there opportunities in other parts of the U.S. or even globally?
Yeah, location is absolutely critical in this game.
Okay.
The U.S. is currently the most developed market for farmland investing,
Right.
but you have to consider the regional nuances.
And I'm guessing this is where our friends at NCREI come in handy again.
Oh, absolutely, those data wizards.
Data wizards. Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, for instance, you've got the Corn Belt,
Right, the Midwest.
stretching across states like Iowa, Illinois.
Huge corn and soybean production.
Exactly. And as you might expect, that region is heavily influenced by those crop prices. But then you head over to the Pacific region, and it's a whole different ballgame.
Okay, what are we looking at there?
California in particular is known for its high-value permanent crops.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Almonds, pistachios, grapes, you name it. They're a big deal over there.
So location, location, location.
Yeah.
California with its climate, those iconic crops,
It's a hot spot for permanent crop investment.
and that global demand is just driving things even further.
Absolutely.
It's not just a U.S. story, though, is it?
No, it's not. One of the reports you shared even highlighted growing interest in permanent crops in Europe,
Really? Where in Europe?
particularly in southern European countries,
Okay.
like Spain and Portugal. They have the climate for it.
Right, right.
And investors are starting to notice. So, yeah, the permanent crops market is definitely expanding beyond its traditional borders.
So we're talking about a global shift in the way people are looking at this.
Definitely. It's becoming more mainstream.
And speaking of mainstream, we can talk about returns and investment strategies all day long.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if there's no demand for the actual product, those returns are meaningless.
You hit the nail on the head. Demand is key.
Like, you can't sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo, as they say.
Exactly. Although with climate change, maybe that's not such a crazy idea anymore.
You might be onto something. But yeah, demand is everything.
It is. And for permanent crop investors, those demand drivers are strong.
So why are these crops in such high demand? Break it down for us.
Well, a couple of reasons. First, you've got population growth, right?
More people, more mouths to feed.
Exactly. That increases the demand for nutrient-rich foods, and that includes things like nuts and fruits.
Makes sense.
And then you've got rising incomes in developing countries.
Right.
So as incomes grow, so do people's dietary preferences, right?
People start moving away from those basic staples towards more diverse, protein-rich foods.
Exactly. And that plays right into the strengths of permanent crops.
Interesting. So as people have more disposable income, they have more room to prioritize their health and well-being.
It's a trend we're seeing globally, and one stat we came across really highlights this. Global caloric intake has been increasing by about 1.5% annually.
Wow.
Couple that with the fact that arable land is shrinking due to urbanization.
Right. Less land available.
And you've got a classic supply and demand scenario.
Scarcity drives value.
Exactly. It's like investing in precious metals, but instead of gold or silver, we're talking about almonds and avocados.
All right. So maybe not something you'd find in Fort Knox, but valuable nonetheless.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those long-term trends
Right.
and positioning yourself to benefit from them. And this is where the whole ESG element comes into play.
ESG, right. Environmental, social, and governance factors.
It's becoming increasingly important to investors, not just a niche thing anymore.
It's not just about profit. It's about aligning your money with your values.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just about feeling good either. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests aligning your investments with sustainability goals can actually be good for your portfolio too.
So doing well by doing good. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's really becoming mainstream thought, you know.
Yeah.
It's not just a feel-good thing anymore.
Right.
Like, there's actual data to support it.
Yeah.
One report, I think it was Morgan Stanley, they found that sustainable funds actually outperformed traditional funds.
Right.
Yeah, in the first half of 2023.
Wow. That's pretty impressive. So it really is possible to do well by doing good.
It seems that way, yeah.
But let's bring it back down to earth for a second here.
Okay.
We talked earlier about permanent crops adding some resilience to a portfolio, especially during those times when the market's a bit like a roller coaster.
Right.
Lots of ups and downs.
Yeah, that low correlation really comes into play during those downturns.
Got any hard data or real world examples to kind of back that up?
Oh, absolutely. Remember we were talking about farmland's low correlation with other assets?
With stocks and bonds, right?
Exactly. Well, one of the reports you sent actually compared a hypothetical portfolio.
Okay.
50-50 split, timberland and farmland.
Okay.
And they compared that against the S&P 500 during those major periods of, financial turmoil.
So let me guess, we were talking the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s.
Uh-huh.
The global financial crisis, what was that, 2008?
Yep.
And then, just to throw in a more recent one, the whole pandemic crash of 2020.
You got it. Those are the ones. And here's the thing. While the S&P 500, took a pretty significant hit during those periods,
Right.
the timberland and farmland portfolio, it remained pretty much stable.
Really?
Yeah, even posted positive returns in some cases.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It really does highlight how these alternative assets, they can act as a buffer, right?
Yeah, like a shock absorber for your portfolio.
Exactly. Smooth out those bumps on the road a little bit. So it makes you wonder, why isn't everybody jumping on this permanent crop bandwagon?
Well, it's not quite as simple as just planting a few trees and watching the money roll in.
Right. Right, of course not. There's got to be more to it than that.
There are complexities, yeah.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, not all permanent crops are created equal.
Oh, I bet. You got your high maintenance types and then your more low-key ones, just like with anything else, right?
Precisely. Some crops need a lot more attention.
Right.
Some take longer to start producing. Others might be more prone to, pests or diseases.
So you really do need to do your homework.
Research is key. You got to understand the crop, the risks, the market demand.
Right. And what about things like water rights? I
Right.
mean, that's got to be a major factor, especially with climate change and everything.
Absolutely. Water is essential, and it can be a major issue in some regions.
Right. So it's not just about picking a spot on the map with decent weather.
Mm.
Sounds like due diligence is critical in this game.
It's essential, and it's not just about understanding the crop or the region.
Okay.
It's also about evaluating the investment structure, the management team, all of that.
Especially if you go in with a private fund, right?
Yeah.
You want to make sure those fees are actually worth it.
Exactly. Transparency is so important.
Yeah.
Where's your money going? How are they using those fees? What kind of returns can you realistically expect?
Right. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme, that's for sure.
No, definitely not.
It's about playing the long game, being patient, doing your research.
Exactly. And it's also about aligning your investments with your values, Do you believe in supporting sustainable agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to be part of the solution when it comes to climate change, food security, those big issues?
Yeah, those are important considerations.
They are. It's about finding investments that resonate with you on that level.
Right, investing with a purpose. But for those who might be hesitant to tie up a huge chunk of their portfolio for such a long time,
Yeah.
are there ways to, dip their toes in the water before going all in?
There are, yeah. One option is to look into investing in companies that operate within the permanent crop space.
Okay, so not owning the farmland directly, but more like buying shares in companies that are involved in the whole process.
Exactly. Think agricultural technology, sustainable farming practices, even food companies that use ingredients sourced from permanent crops.
Oh, that's a good point. So you're still participating in the growth of the sector, but without the same level of commitment or expertise needed for, owning the land outright.
Exactly. And you get that added benefit of liquidity since you're dealing with publicly traded companies.
Yeah. Right, you can buy and sell more easily.
Exactly. And if you're investing in companies with strong ESG principles, you're still aligning your portfolio with those values we talked about.
So you're having your cake and eating it too. But instead of cake, it's a sustainable and hopefully profitable investment portfolio.
That's a great way to put it.
I'll work on my metaphors later.
Yeah.
But for now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the global landscape for permanent crops.
Okay.
We've touched on the U.S., we've talked about Europe, but what about other regions?
Right.
Are there other parts of the world that investors should have on their radar?
Definitely. There are some really interesting things happening in other parts of the world.
Like where?
South America, for one.
Yeah.
It's got huge potential.
What makes you say that?
Well, think about it. They've got vast amounts of fertile land, favorable climates for all sorts of crops,
Right.
and they're already becoming a major player in the global agricultural market.
So it's like the sleeping giant of permanent crops is starting to awaken.
That's a great way to put it. Countries like Chile have really made a name for themselves.
Oh, how so?
They're big exporters of avocados and blueberries now,
Interesting.
supplying those fruits to, the whole world.
Wow, that's impressive. And what about Brazil? They're already a powerhouse when it comes to coffee and sugarcane, right?
Exactly. And with all that land, they have so much potential to expand into other permanent crops.
It sounds like South America is a region with a good mix of established industries and then this huge untapped potential.
Exactly. It's a really exciting time to be watching that market.
It really is. Now, what about other parts of the world? What about Africa?
Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it's got such a diverse range of climates and landscapes.
That's true.
There have to be opportunities for permanent crops there too, right?
You're absolutely right. Africa has tremendous potential.
Okay.
We're already seeing a lot of interest in places like East Africa, for example.
What kind of crops are we talking about there?
Well, they're already known for coffee and tea, of course, but they're also starting to produce more macadamia nuts.
Macadamia nuts, really?
Yeah, they're becoming incredibly popular globally.
Yeah, those things are dangerously delicious.
Yeah.
I can definitely see the global appeal.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot of potential there, but...
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, investing in developing regions, it's not without its challenges.
That's understandable. What are some of the things investors should be aware of?
Infrastructure can be a hurdle in some areas.
Right, getting those crops to market.
Exactly. And then there's political stability, which can also be a factor.
Makes sense. You want to make sure your investment is, relatively secure.
Absolutely. So yeah, due diligence, it's even more crucial in these emerging markets.
So it's not just about, chasing the highest potential returns.
No, not at all.
It's about being responsible too.
Absolutely. You want to make sure these projects are benefiting the local communities as well.
Right, promoting sustainable development.
That's what it's all about, finding that balance between profitability and positive impact.
It's investing with a conscience.
Exactly. And that's something that permanent crops, they really offer that opportunity.
They do, yeah. So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of permanent crops, from the crops themselves to the global opportunities.
It's a big world out there.
It is. As we wrap things up here, is there any, final thought, a golden nugget of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
If I had to sum it all up, I'd say this.
Okay, I'm listening.
Permanent crops offer a really unique and compelling investment opportunity. It's a chance to earn potentially attractive returns, but also align your portfolio with a more sustainable future.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah. Just do your research, understand the risks, and choose your investments wisely. That's key.
And about taking that long-term perspective.
Exactly. That's what it's all about.
Words of wisdom. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, explored some really interesting ideas.
Well, it's been fun.
It has. And as always, a huge thank you to you, the listener, for sending us all this fascinating research. Hopefully this episode has given you some valuable insights, maybe even inspired you to explore the world of farmland investing, permanent crops, all that good stuff. Until next time, happy investing.